स्टार्ट कीजिए।
Okay, please start.
Good afternoon to one and all the dignitaries present here. A warm welcome to you all in this sunny Sunday. We are gathered here for yet another informative discourse. I, Preeti Dave, once again welcome you all to this online platform of Shakespeare Certificate course held under the banner of Shakespeare Society of Central India. In collaboration for the success of the entire course, we also have along with us Department of English HISLOP College Nagpur, SANTAJI Mahavidyalaya Nagpur, RAJKUMAR KEWAL RAMANI Mahavidyalaya Nagpur, and JM Patel Arts, Commerce and Science College Bhandara. To begin with, I would emphasize that the entire session is organized to celebrate Shakespeare's birthday for not just a day, but for 8 consecutive days, now being the second half of the fifth day of celebration. For the second half of the today's session, we have amidst us Dr. Isabel Santa Rita Vaz, who will enlighten us with her topic entitled Shakespeare and Theatre. Here I quote American actor Terence Mann, who says, "Movie will make you famous, television will make you rich, but theater will make you good." And we seriously can't agree more as it is, not only the artist, but for art lovers and admirers. Theatre has witnessed various forms and cultures for at least 2,500 years. Theatre as performance has evolved from ideas and customs, honoring gods and mythical creatures and characters, and thus it won't be wrong to say that theatrical styles are influenced by their time and place, artistic and other social structures, as well as individual style of particular artist or artists. Thus, theatre plays significant role in bringing change, not individualistic, but leads to social change, where artists put forth their views regarding positive change they wish to witness for the betterment of society, to eradicate social norms, and to make this beautiful world worth living in. Theatre brings one of the oldest form, being one of the oldest form, one might be surprised to discover how theatre has changed over the years. It's one of our oldest art forms, so it had plenty of time to evolve over the centuries. Let's explore rich and fascinating history of theatre to be very specific to the today's topic, Shakespeare and theatre. And for this, I would like to hand over the mic to our dignified resource person, Dr. Isabella Santa Rita Vaz, Associate Professor, Dempe College of Arts and Science, Miramar, Goa. She is the founder member of the Mustard Seed Art Company, director, actor, and a playwright. Some of her plays have been published as Frescoes in the Womb, Six Plays from Goa, Broadway, Goa, 1556. Before handing over the mic, I would also like to highlight her PhD topic titled Performing Change, a study of theatre in context of social transformation in Asia in 20th century. Over to you, ma'am.
A very good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I have a small problem here to pass from one link to the other. It has, the connectivity is not so good, so I will not present my slides. I will speak. I can see the slides, but they are not online. So I will do the best. I don't want to delay the meeting. So let me begin by thanking the Shakespeare Society of India and especially Dr. Usha, who was kind enough to allot me an opportunity to speak on a topic that is quite close to my heart, and that is Shakespeare and theatre. I have called it an introduction. Anything to do with theatre interests me. And I hope it interests you also, the students. The first reference to Shakespeare in his own day in literary circles was by a poet and a dramatist, Robert Greene. I think you have probably read about this in Green's piece of writing called Groat's Worth of Wit. Green refers to Shakespeare as an upstart crow who is in his own conceit the only shake seen in a country. We don't really know exactly what he means by this, but it is obviously sardonic and he is obviously insulting Shakespeare. Why is he doing this? Is it some form of a rivalry amongst playwrights? Very possible. We find that by the year 1592, only aged 28, Shakespeare was in London and already established as both an actor and a dramatist. Please keep in mind, he was both a player and a shareholder in the company, as well as its leading dramatist. Shakespeare wrote the majority of the 37 plays which are now accepted as his, as well as collaborating on several more between 1594 and 1613. As an actor, William Shakespeare was an actor too. He was associated with the parts of kings and old men, I believe. And his roles may have included the ghost in Hamlet and old Adam in As You Like It. Now just reflect for a moment. William Shakespeare wrote in 16th century England, but he's still read and he's still performed today all over the world. This is a small introduction to the man, his times and his work, locating him primarily as a theatre artist. As students of literature, all of us, you and me, we often forget that Shakespeare was not only a writer, but also a performer of plays. I think when we do this, we miss an interesting and relevant facet of his career, the theatricality of his work. But Shakespeare could not forget that he was a theatre man. He often uses theatrical imagery. You're sure to know the following quote. "All the world's a stage," he says, "and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts, his act being 7 ages." As you know, this is from As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7. And an even more powerful quote from Macbeth, where Macbeth says, "Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Such powerful words. Imagine them being spoken on stage for a live audience. Today we will glance briefly at William Shakespeare as an extremely popular and successful theatre performer, even as he was a writer of extraordinary literary genius. These are two significantly interrelated facets of his artistry. Was Shakespeare, the man of literature, influenced in any way by Shakespeare, the man of performance? I think so. Shakespeare was not an armchair playwright. He wrote plays specifically to be performed by his theatre company. Don't forget that. And if we think about Shakespeare and his dramatic world, We can take note of drama, which in common parlance, we use the word to refer to literature, and theatre. We use the word quite often to foreground performance. And then there are these various aspects that we can look at: the playwright, the performance space, the audience, the written text, the story of a play, the socio-political context of Elizabethan theatre, the dramatic tradition, the forms and the genre of drama that Shakespeare practiced, and meta-theatricality as a trait of Shakespeare's plays. You know, I have been a teacher. I am retired now. One interesting incident that happened was what a student wrote to me. I have a question to ask you. How do we, you and I, generally meet Shakespeare? We may read Shakespeare in class or at home and not really keep in mind that we are participating in theatre, not merely reading an armchair play, perhaps similar to a novel. We need, I think, keep in mind the theatricality of the script. An international student sent me a message when he finished his MA course, and this is what he said. During my bachelor degree in my country, we studied a play of Shakespeare, and ever since I did not like Shakespeare at all, he says. But last night, I ordered 7 of his plays to take them with me and read them in my spare time. He goes on to say that a new experience of reading had transformed, again I quote, the boring and detestable Shakespeare to an amazing and adorable character in my life, unquote. Now, this is one student's reaction, certainly not everybody's, but I believe that the transformation follows from a shift from reading Shakespeare as a string of profound but difficult words and ideas that must be studied, to reading, let us say, Julius Caesar or Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth as a great piece of living theatre, as well as literature that throws exciting light on our existence. Theatre for Shakespeare was a live performance. Who was this playwright? William Shakespeare, born in 1564, dying in 1616. He was the son of John Shakespeare, a whittaker, a man who worked with white leather, and a glove maker, a cobbler, we would call him. He was a craftsman. John Shakespeare made enough money to buy a house, and he married Mary Arden, who inherited land and money. And John Shakespeare, William's father, was the town's bailiff, like a mayor. And they lived, as you know for sure, on Stratford-upon-Avon, a quiet market town with a population of less than 2,000 people when William was born. Interesting fact, because when Shakespeare played in a theatre, sometimes the audience was bigger than the entire population of Stratford-upon-Avon, where he had been born and he had lived the early days of his life. Stratford-upon-Avon, surrounded by English countryside, close to Oxford and Coventry. There were regular markets, passing travelers, unhygienic Stratford, which was affected by the plague in a big way, because there were rats and fleas, and it led to the closing of the theatres. Did he study, this man of ours, William Shakespeare? Yes, he He went to the local petty school. He learned to read, to write, and learned mathematics. Then he probably went to grammar school. And what did he study there? Latin, literature, Greek, divinity, classical history, rhetoric, arithmetic. Is this important? Yes, it is important, because this is the baggage that Shakespeare carried and from which he drew in order to write his extremely great and erudite plays. We don't have too many records about his grammar school, but we know that 3 of his masters in his school were Oxford men. So they were not country bumpkins. They were erudite professors who taught him. Shakespeare never went to university, unlike the university wits like John Lilly, Thomas Kidd, George Peele, Robert Greene. Yes, Robert Greene, the one who called Shakespeare an upstart crow. Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, Thomas Lodge, these were university wits. And they sometimes criticized William Shakespeare for lack of refinement. So that was that prejudice. Shakespeare, we know, spelled his own name in 6 different ways. Why so? Simple. Spelling was not a priority in Elizabethan times. And here we have a small town, Stratford-upon-Avon. And that is where Shakespeare was born, a small population of 2,000 people. But small population means there was close contact with one another. And I'm sure extremely good interpersonal relationships. He married Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years older to him. And then for 7 years, we don't have any record of William Shakespeare between 1585 and 1592. They are known as his lost years. How did he spend them? And you might ask me, what does it matter anyway, how he spent 7 lost years? Did he do nothing? Did he become an apprentice glove maker with his father? Did he study law? Because there's so many references to law in his plays. Did he become a teacher? And so did he read other plays? Did he join the army? Was he a spy like Christopher Marlowe? Did he travel on the continent so that he came to know the world better? By 1592, William had left his family in Stratford and was working in London. As what? As an actor in a company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And then later he became a playwright and a sharer of his own company. We know little about Shakespeare the man. What did he read? Where did he get books? Did he travel? Many researchers have devoted their lives to finding out. Many writers try to speculate. What did he feel about his family? We don't know. Not a word do we have about his personal feelings. We know nothing, for example, about how he felt when his 11-year-old son died. 11-year-old boy. He died, possibly of the bubonic plague. The boy's name was Hamlet. In a recent novel titled Hamlet, the writer Maggie O'Farrell, winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction in the year 2020, she wrote a novel called Hamlet, and she tries to give life to the impact that his death might have had on the family. His mother, Hamlet's mother, stayed with the family in Stratford. Father left for London, and later he wrote a play with the title Hamlet. What was it like to lose a child to bubonic plague? We don't know. We only know what the characters in Shakespeare's plays say, feel, and think. How did William turn into a playwright? I'm sure there must have been a whole lot of plays being staged around the country and the countryside in his time. In fact, we have a record. We know that a play was performed in his town by professional players who were called the Queen's Men when William was a small boy. Did he watch the play? Probably so, yes, because his father was the bailiff of the town. And the bailiff had the job of paying the actors. And the bailiff had the privilege of the front seats for the play. Certainly, the little boy must have sat with his father. He was 4 years old. So the conjecture is that the small son was probably with the father, and the theater was something that fascinated William all his life. Now, in Shakespeare's day, there were other performances as well, other pastimes, you would say, other kinds of entertainment. Do you know what they were? Football, cockfights, goose pulling. No, you don't want to know what that means. It means pulling geese. Horrible. Watching executions and theater. So theater artists had to entertain a motley crowd who was used to abundant action and suspense. So actors had to be good. They were professional artists. They were paid. Acting was not anybody's business. It was an exacting profession. And the plays belonged to the company, not to the playwright. And Shakespeare was a sharer. He received a share of the company's profits. He also acted in other plays, for instance, Ben Jonson's plays. And this man, Shakespeare, was not from the nobility. He was from the middle class, a simple man like you and me. He rose to be rather wealthy. He bought a coat of arms for his father, and he bought a big house which still exists in England. Shakespeare's London, there is a critic called Bill Bryson who says, few places in history can have been more deadly and desirable at the same time as London in the 16th century. Deadly and desirable. Life expectancy did not exceed 35 years. Can you believe that? So Shakespeare found himself in an overwhelmingly youthful London. The people were young, and young people want good entertainment. London was a city where a single theatre house held more people than his entire hometown. The River Thames, the main artery for movement of goods and people. It was a very prosperous town. And London Bridge had on top of the bridge more than 100 shops. On top of the bridge, in numerous buildings. So a very lively town. And the square around St. Paul's Cathedral was an open square. It was a market where printers and stationers congregated, and more than 7,000 titles were published in London during Elizabeth's reign. 7,000 books were published during the reign of Queen Elizabeth in London alone. So it was a very attractive city to a young man who loved the magic of words. So what was Shakespeare the performer's day like? Just keep this in mind. As a playwright, he had to write new plays to keep the playhouse full. He had to read widely and be aware of what others had written. As an actor, he had to learn hundreds of lines regularly. I'm sure some of you must have acted. Think what it means to learn hundreds of lines for a play. As a member of a cast, he had to attend rehearsals. As a sharer, he had to be concerned about the monetary part of theatre. And as a popular playwright, he could not afford to suffer from writer's block. Why did Shakespeare carry on at this terrific pace? Why not just write sonnets and some poems that assured him of patronage? Oh, we can guess. It was the aliveness of theatre, with a dynamic cast and a live audience. That is what theatre is. It is words, plus action, plus music, plus a visual feast. Now, Shakespeare was part of a dramatic tradition that has been theatre of various forms all over the world from early antiquity. In India, for instance, we have had in the past classical theatre as well as folk theatre. And all over the world, we've had great theatre. In Greece, as you know, great dramatic literature and performance. And a little later, in ancient Rome. In ancient Greek theatre, around 600 BC, we had tragedy, comedy, satire, words like chorus, orchestra, scene. These were all invented in ancient Greece. And then they were borrowed by Roman theatre. Now, why are we talking about this? Because theatre in England borrowed from this classical tradition. And interestingly, the first theatres in Britain were built by the Romans, yes, in the Roman Empire. And when the Roman Empire collapsed, so did they. By medieval times, entertainments were provided at fairgrounds, in church squares and market squares. There were mimes, mystery, miracle, morality plays. And in Elizabethan England, the theatre was the name of the first public theatre house erected by James Burbage. Companies of actors traveled around the countryside putting on plays. And James Burbage was a carpenter who became an actor, then the company's leader. In the Elizabethan age, we find a major historical period for London theatre. Queen Elizabeth I was a great patron of the arts, and the most famous recipient of her patronage was William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was called upon for regular performances at the royal court. And remember, Merry Wives of Windsor was commissioned by the Queen. And the Queen's patronage was vital for the support and popularity of Shakespeare's company and his plays. In 1572, a new law was passed. It was called Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds. And traveling actors had to be under the patronage of a nobleman. James Burbage had the patronage of the Earl of Leicester. Later, he received the offer of the patronage of the Queen herself, Elizabeth I. Only men and boys performed in Shakespeare's company. Why? You can surely guess. The previous presentation this morning spoke a great deal about women and women's location in society. Theatre has never been welcoming for women actors, too public a space, and therefore only boys performed. Women sat in the audience, some women, but actors were all male. And keep in mind that plays were performed every single day in London. Can you imagine? A new play had to be ready. When there was a performance, a silk flag was flown from the roof of the theatre and a trumpet would sound. So theatre was a popular form of art in England, and it was favored by the Queen, later by the King. However, there was anti-theatrical prejudice from certain sections of society, the puritanical sections. Theatre houses were not situated inside London City because of that prejudice. They were situated on the outskirts of the city. Plays were regulated, they were licensed. And in later years, after Shakespeare's day, the Puritans closed the theatre houses, and because they were called places of immorality. Some players were well known as fools or clowns, while others specialized in tragic roles. It was a layered society, and there was a growing mood of confidence in Elizabethan England, a relative political stability, some religious tolerance, economic upsurge, and theatre could thrive. Then the plague hit England, and theatres closed until 1594. And what happens when theatres close? Shakespeare and his group had to leave the city. They could not really stay idle. You and I know what a pandemic does. And this particular bubonic plague was a pandemic that caused much death and suffering. So what Shakespeare and his company did was they toured the countryside for a while. And then once the plague abated, they came back to London. And London became the center of the largest theatre-going population in the world. The performance space is very important. The space shapes the performance. Is it an open space? Is it a closed hall? Are you performing on the street? Is it an arena? In China, they performed in a theatre house. In India, in the temple courtyard. And we know that some of Shakespeare's audience stood. They paid 1 penny and they stood throughout the play in the uncovered yard of a playhouse. But if you could pay 2 pennies, you could get a balcony seat. And a whole lot of things about the space determined the Shakespeare script. This theatre house where he performed was called the Globe Theatre. Interesting name, no? The Globe. This was an age which was, becoming aware of the whole world. Today we use the word globalized. Shakespeare's London was quite globalized. It housed 3,000 people, the Globe Theatre. And there were galleries, there was a yard, there was a gallery where the musicians sat, there were gentlemen's rooms, and the stage was rectangular, tapering in front, big enough for about 12 actors only. They didn't have much time for rehearsals, so Shakespeare had scenes had plays for 2 or 3 characters or 1 character dominating a crowd. Boy actors was all he had, so his female roles were few. The Globe was owned and operated by a syndicate. The first Globe burnt down in 1613 when its thatch caught fire during a performance of Shakespeare and Fletcher's play Henry VIII. How did it catch fire? Because they burst a cannon. They fired a cannon on stage to announce the arrival of the king on stage. But it misfired and it set fire to the thatched roof. After a while, the second Globe was built on the foundations of the first, and there they put a tiled roof. From 1609, the king's men used the Globe during the summer and an indoor playhouse at Blackfriars during the winter. But the burning of the globe in 1613 may have affected Shakespeare very deeply, even though the playhouse was quickly rebuilt. By 1613, his activity as a poet and dramatist was over, and he had apparently returned to live in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he died less than 3 years later. The Elizabethan theatre used very elaborate and expensive costumes, but very scanty sets and scenery, and the dialogue provided much of the required information. And that is why Shakespeare's script is so very rich. So when Blackfriars came into existence, it was a different architecture, and Shakespeare's plays, his scripts became different. The London audience, made up of lords and ladies, as well as common people, as well as street beggars and vagrants, was a very motley crowd. The audiences were loud, they clapped, they booed, they threw rotten fruit on the actors. Some sat on the fringe of the stage. So, not easy. What about the text, the written text? The original manuscripts that we find are, some of them called foul papers, because they were full of corrections. Then there were fair copies made by a scribe. Then there were actors' copies that were only given to the actors. Only the actor's part was given to him. Shakespeare would have got to know his actors very well, and he probably wrote parts with specific actors in mind. Later, after he died, Hemmings and Condell, who were actors themselves, published 36 of Shakespeare's plays. Thank God they did. After Shakespeare's death, otherwise we might have had access only to those foul copies. Shakespeare was a great storyteller. What would make his plays a powerful performance? He had to know the taste of the audience. He had to give action, suspense, thrills. He had to find emotional engagement, characters that touch the heart, imaginative settings, audiences who went to Venice, went to the Forest of Arden, realism as well as fantasy, from courts of law to ghosts and magicians. Reflection, that means the writer's insights on life and language, lyrical, philosophical, at times earthy. Shakespeare invariably gave more than they could have, than the audience could have expected. Did he borrow? Yes, but the concept of plagiarism did not exist in Shakespeare's day. So he borrowed widely, but the sources from which he borrowed are dead and gone, and Shakespeare is very much alive. Now, Shakespeare did not invent tragedies, comedies, histories, and fantasies. He inherited them. He inherited them from ancient Greece, but he perfected them. And tragedies like Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, or comedies like Measure for Measure of Taming of the Shrew, or histories like Julius Caesar, who but Shakespeare could have created them? The context, socio-political context in Shakespeare's day was that the Spanish Armada had been defeated. There was some religious tolerance. The Elizabethan age was an age of great exploration. There was new wealth, and the monarchy loved theatre. So keep in mind that the monarchy, the king or the queen, had enormous powers. They could banish the playwright from the country. They could imprison, they could detain, they could execute. So playwrights who wrote plays with political undertones had to be keenly aware that they would be watched by the monarch. But there is room in theater for a language of symbols and figurative references, for gestures and action that the audience would relish, yet might go uncensored. Shakespeare wrote great tragedies, great comedies. He wrote Hamlet, and for that, we are all totally grateful. He discusses questions of power, questions of mental stability. He offers great characterization, great diversity. We have comedy like Merchant of Venice, where he shows us conflicts of interest, usury, legal acumen, men and women, anti-Semitic prejudice. Pastoral comedy like As You Like It, the court versus the forest. The Tempest, a fantasy. Keep in mind, the Tempest begins in the sea and moves to the island. How did Shakespeare stage the Tempest on an Elizabethan stage? They didn't have light effects. They had very limited sound effects. Anyway, he did. And the history plays, so many of them. And one last point that I want to make is that Shakespeare did not write a play about drama, about a play. But he did write a play within a play in two of his plays. And we use the term meta-drama or meta-theatricality for this concept, where the playwright calls attention to the fact that we are in the theater. So there's a play within a play in Hamlet, in The Mousetrap, and The Midsummer Night's Dream. So not only is Shakespeare read today, but he is widely performed in his original language as well as in adaptation and in translation, not only on the theater stage, but also on the cinema screen. Films, novels are connected to Shakespeare, graphic novels as well. And I'm very glad to tell you, as I wind up my presentation, that my theater group was also privileged to do one of Shakespeare's plays, except that we called it not As I Like It, but As We Like It. And we had a great time. So, is it drama or theater that takes the spotlight? Is it literature or performance? I would say that Shakespeare wrote both to be performed and to be read by those who wished to do so. We find in the published work of William Shakespeare both drama and theater. And I thank you for your patience. Imagine what Shakespeare must have sounded like on stage. And I began by telling you that the first reference to Shakespeare was by Robert Greene, who called him a crow, an upstart crow. But the greatest, shall we say, eulogy to Shakespeare was from a theater man called Ben Jonson, who says, and I quote, "Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage. He was not of an age, but for all time." Unquote. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. If you give me half a minute, I will make sure that my phone does not run out of power. I'll be back in half a minute. Yes, I'm back.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an interesting, elaborative, and capturing discourse. You kindled among us various aspects of Shakespearean theatre. It indeed was enriching and scholastic expedition explored under your able guidance. Your passion for theatre is quite visible, the way you gave justice to your presentation. You asked us to reflect and compare the era he wrote and he is still being performed, brings so much relevance to even today's world. Shakespeare was an artist, playwright, performer. Performances, story, political context, forms, and genre that he practiced all were brought into light through this discourse. We need to keep in mind the theatricality, his art forms, his profound ideas brought forth through his characters, the literature that throws exciting light on while reading Shakespeare. The baggage Shakespeare carried is clearly visible through his plays. How Shakespeare spent his days as an artist, learned hundreds of lines as a sharer, popular playwright, and still continued for the aliveness of theatre that made him to go on, and even after facing critical and unfavorable situations, we travelled Elizabethan town and Shakespearean world through your scholarly discourse. This was definitely very absorbing discourse, and we could got to know theatre technicality that we fail to understand while reading Shakespeare, and he is very much alive in his plays, but also theatre technicalities he provided to us, art lovers like you and me. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'm just calling you.
Next, I would request our participants to put forth their queries by unmuting themselves for question and answer session. Any questions? I anticipate that the discourse was very clear to you. And thus moving forward towards the conclusion of today's session, where I would like to applause as I admire your patience to join us on your busy Sundays. Here comes the last stage where I would like to extend my gratitude to our venerated and dignified speaker, Dr. Isabella Santa Rita Vaz, to be the part of this short-term certificate course and enlighten us with her educational discourse. Thank you, ma'am. I
Thank
would like
you.
to sin- I would like to sincerely thank President Shakespeare Society of Central India, Dr. Pranati Chakravarti Madam, who always guides and motivates us with her untiring support. I would like to extend my gratitude to Secretary Shakespeare Society of Central India, Dr. Usha Sakure Madam, for her endless efforts she puts in to organize this entire session of 8 days Shakespeare certificate course, without whom it would be difficult to imagine success of the entire program. That and organizers who bracketed together to support the event. Dr. Urmila Dabir ma'am, Dr. Prashant Shedke sir, Dr. Priya Vanjari ma'am, Dr. Vikas Dhomne sir for providing their vigorous support in accomplishing the event. Thanks is also due to all the coordinators, Dr. Veena Joseph ma'am, Dr. Nihar Sheikh sir, Dr. Madhvi Morel ma'am, Dr. Karthik Panikar sir, for your much needed and valuable support. Lastly, I would like to thank our active and patient participants for keeping up the morale and boosting us for running the entire event. And now I call today's session to an end. Thank you for being here with me.